Just off the head. Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome. Today is Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus. Today is Yutes Kislev, the 19th day of Kislev. It's the day the Alter Rebbe came out of imprisonment, and therefore it is the day, as we discussed yesterday, when heaven endorsed the broadcasting of Chassidus to the world. What happens on earth is a reflection of what happens in heaven. When the earthly court released the Alter Rebbe from imprisonment in Russia in 1798, I think it was, then it meant that in heaven they did the same. They were approving his broadcasting of Chassidus to the world, and therefore it's considered amongst Chabad Chassidim the day when we now are able to really deepen our connection to the study of Chassidus and to broadcasting it even further. So we begin this study of Tanya.
What happened to change God's mind?
I don't know what changed God's mind, but
God hasn't.
No, that's an interesting question about changing God's mind. But I mean, I don't know what happened, but initially I would think that just like happened with Moses, and I spoke about this yesterday actually in the class, that just like when Moses wanted to bring the Torah down from Mount Sinai, the angels protested. And Moses had to argue his case in the Talmud. It's documented in the Talmud Shabbos, 55b, I believe it is. That Moses had to argue his case. God says, listen, you want the Torah, you explain to them. Let's see if you can beat them. I believe the same thing happened with Alter Rebbe, whose teachers, whose Yortzeit today is the Magid of Mezrich's Yortzeit today. He's the Rebbe of the Alter Rebbe, his Yortzeit is today. Him and the Baal Shem Tov, his Rebbe's Rebbe, they were the ones that were pleading the case in heaven, just like Moses.
Maybe the people were able to understand at that time.
Okay, so the book of Tanya is not only one of the foundation texts of Chassidus, the most fundamental text of Chassidus. It is also a very fundamental text of the books of Musar. Now, Musar is general character development books in Judaism. Even though the author, in his humility, refers to himself as the collector of ideas. It's called Likutei Amorim, a collection of sayings. Right? Nevertheless, it is a very, very creative and original work, both in its fundamental concept as well as in its many tangents. Now, even though in his humility, in his introduction, he talks about those whom he knows and those that know him, that he writes the book for them. Nevertheless, this book actually applies to all Jews everywhere with all of their problems, not specific to one person in one time and place, and not even to one worldview. This book of Tanya really addresses all the answers to all the questions, and he actually writes that in his introduction, which we'll eventually get to, where he says "Kol hatshuvos al kol hashaylos," all answers to all questions. That's quite a bold statement to make about a book. Imagine you write a book, and my book has all the answers to all the questions.
Especially if you're not humble.
Well, especially if you are humble, how do you do that, right? So what is this really referring to? Welcome to all the people on Zoom, Fran and Corey, Elaine and Marty and Ed and Lauren. Israel wrestles with God every day, and I'm not sure what you're referring to. Israel wrestles. What we were talking about earlier. Okay, gotcha. So how can you make such a statement that you're going to answer all the questions, all the answers? Check this out. So all other books, at least books of character development in Torah, what we call Sifrei Musar, they speak about refinement of specific character traits and how a person can implement them in specific manners, explaining the benefits of certain characteristics, which are appropriate to certain kinds of questions which a person would ask. And therefore, the answers are specific. But the problem with this specific approach is that these teachings are good for certain kind of people with certain kinds of ways of thinking and certain kinds of problems, right? One person can stand before this book and be very impressed, but together with that, he can say that it doesn't talk to me. It doesn't talk to me personally, to my specific personality and my specific burdens. On the flip side, the book of Tanya does not deal with specific problems. Rather, it addresses the core of all of our problems, the very rock bottom foundation of our problems. Placing all the problems of a person, all the problems that a person can possibly experience on a foundation which is very clear, and to address the problems at the core instead of at the symptom, at the surface. An analogy of this idea is when a person has a skin disease. A skin disease. There's two ways to treat the illness, the ailment. One way is a topical cream. Another way is to inject something into the bloodstream. The topical cream would solve the problem on the finger, on the nose, on the shoulder, but only in that specific location. But it doesn't fix the problem at its core, preventing it from popping up elsewhere. But if you infuse something into the bloodstream, then you're cleaning the whole system from the inside at its core. Now it's not going to come up anywhere. That's the uniqueness of the Book of Tanya. By being able to address the core of the human psyche, by being able to address the very essence of good and evil within a person, if you can capture and understand how it works at the very core, then any manifestation of souls, any manifestation of evil, of struggle within us, would be an extension of what's going on at our core. So if you look at it this way, if you think of the struggles of human beings today, what do people struggle with today? Just pick a couple things that come into our tongue: anxiety, loneliness, estrangement, emptiness, boredom. Think about that, right? Fears, insecurities, lack of self-esteem. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But all the above, you have two ways to deal with them. Either we can write a book about self-esteem, a book about insecurities, a book about loneliness. You can do that. And that would address, it's very nice work, addressing each of those topics. So somebody can look at the book and say, this is amazing, but I'm not lonely, but I'm sure it's good for a lot of people. Right? I'm not estranged, but I'm sure for people that are, this would be a fantastic piece of work. But now imagine you write a book which says all of the above, that entire spectrum, is just a manifestation of our soul not being nourished properly. A manifestation of what lies at your very core. You have a godly soul and you also have an animal soul. And if the godly soul is not being nurtured, it will manifest in any of those. Now you're okay. So this is a book that applies to everyone. Right? That's what's happening over here in the Book of Tanya. Right? You with me? The book is founded on the general on the general common denominator of all of the problems of the internal problems of the soul. It goes to the very original source of our problems. And that's pretty amazing, to go to the very original source of our problems, right? Just a second, it's my Wi-Fi. I want to see what she needs. Honey, you okay? Came now where? I'm in the middle of teaching. Came now where? What? No, after is better. Let me call you in a few minutes, okay?
Okay, so it won't be before 11. Okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, bye. Okay. Sorry about that.
Can I interject?
Sure.
So the basis of him writing this was because all the Hasidim were asking him all
Exactly. Yes.
And now he's writing a book to answer all those questions.
Correct.
Now let's contrast.
And just to comment on that, he wrote an introduction, and we'll read it eventually, that he said, look, I'm running out of time. People ask me questions, and many of them are the same questions.
Now let's contrast.
So I'm writing a book with all the answers to all the questions. That way you don't have to talk to me anymore.
So let's now go to the current Rebbe, the past Rebbe. He did what the previous Rebbe did without the book. He had all the people come to him with their problems.
You mean our Rebbe?
Yeah.
In private audience?
Yeah.
Okay.
Why didn't he just say, Read Tanya.
Okay, so let me.
That's heavy. You got-
What's heavy?
Tanya.
Tanya's heavy.
Deep dive.
Okay, so let me try to comment on that a few things. Unless you want to.
No. No, I didn't.
That's an interesting question. So like, if you have all the answers to all the questions, then like, okay, for the rest of the time, we're good. All the rabbis can go on sabbatical, right? So why do you need rabbis?
To teach you Tanya.
Okay, that's actually a good point. And he says that in the introduction. He says, okay, now I understand not everybody can understand this.
Right.
He says it's important for us to have rabbis that will teach this, right? Good. But let me say this.
But your video on Fridays is people who are very, very learned coming to the Rebbe with specific problems they have, and the Rebbe gives them advice. I would say go to chapter 3 on Tanya. It's right there.
I know, but you've read Tanya. It's heavy stuff.
I'm nothing compared to them.
No, but it's deep dive stuff.
Look, first of all, I just want to say this. I mean, you can't just give people a book and say, here,
Doesn't work.
you've got to be able to, if you're
a
going to,
medical book to a medical student saying here.
yeah, it's like saying, why do we need doctors?
Why
Why do we need doctors? Say, give the book to everybody who needs who's going to know.
Take out your own
They
opinion.
have
Look.
a mortgage. Why do you go to a lawyer? You can read a law book. They have a mortgage.
Look, so let me just explain. I just want to give an explanation here. So- I think that the Rebbe was dealing with a generation that was broken. A generation that was totally broken. I mean, think about how the Rebbe met with Eli Wiesel, for example, in a famous exchange. The Rebbe met with Eli Wiesel. He was a guy that wasn't interested in learning Tanya. He was totally, this guy was a broken soul out of the Holocaust, right? When the Rebbe met with Professor Velvel Green was a professor in Minnesota, astrophysicist or something. This is a guy thought he knew everything, right? I don't need Torah, God. Who needs that? I am God because I'm an astrophysicist, that kind of approach. A lot of people are like that. They're so full of themselves, they have no space for anything. So you need to be able to, and I teach this idea that we don't pray so that we can solve our problems. We don't pray so that we can solve our problems. We have problems so that we will have reason to pray. So God gives us problems so that we will have a reason to connect with him. Right? Now, I believe that God will send problems to certain people at certain points in their lives so that they will have reason to discover their own spirituality. Because if you never had any problems, you'd never discover your own spirituality. Which means that's the entry level of your journey. So when the Rebbe is meeting with people, instead of throwing a book at them, like that's what I do all day, every day. I meet with people and I talk to them and listen to them. When I reach a certain point, I say, okay, now I'd like you to learn. I can't learn with everybody individually. I just can't do that. So I say, look, come to a class or maybe learn with me online. And then when you have questions, let me know. So then we can talk because once I can bring you to the water, now you can drink, right? Once you're at the water and you're ready to drink, right? I hope that answers the question, right? Also, the Rebbe, by the way, ran out of time as well. The private audiences went until, what was it, the 80s, 78, I think. And then the Rebbe ran out of time. He started doing the dollars, giving everybody a few seconds instead of a few minutes, right? Which is an interesting concept. Anyways, the guidance in the book of Tanya is directed at a person with an eye at the thousands of his sophisticated problems. In other words, the book is directed at your core, at your essence, with an understanding that it's going to manifest in any one of the thousands, countless ways of a person's sophisticated anxieties or problems, right? The doubts and all sorts of problems that he struggles with. When we look at them as manifestations of what's going on at your core, right? Now we can treat them at the root when we realize that this is representing or manifesting the struggle between good and evil within his own soul. So when you can understand what a person is at his core, it's great. Think about it like in Africa, you got these witch doctors, right? They say a story in South Africa of a black man telling a white man that he has a good doctor for him. So he says, which doctor? And the black man says, yes, Witch doctor, right? That's the joke, whatever. So you got a witch doctor. What's a witch doctor?
So who's on first?
Right. So think about it. I mean, you go to these primitive kind of doctors. They deal with the symptoms, right? But then you go to a really, really good doctor, and he's got X-rays. Oh, you got X-rays. Now we can talk about what's going on behind the scenes, right? You're dealing with blood tests, urine samples. You can see what's going on a deeper level. So we say like this. We say that Sigmund Freud, mental health in general, mental health has been overlooked for eons. I mean, how much time do we have to deal with mental health? Think about it. For thousands of years. If you were alive in the morning, you were ahead of the game, right? But to worry about how happy my marriage is, to worry about whether I'm sleeping quality sleep at night or not, we don't have time for these problems.
Maybe that's where the adage comes from, is treating the symptoms, not the cure.
Right.
That's
That's
exactly,
the time
that's
right
exactly,
now.
100%. Here he's treating the cure, not the symptoms. That's exactly. So I think for thousands of years we were struggling for survival. It's now in our generation, when we are the most privileged generation in the history of the world. I don't think it's a stretch to say that no other generation in history has been as wealthy as ours. Right? Think about it. Right?
Material.
Materialistically, right? So today we have the gift of being able to have the time to worry about the quality of our marriages and the quality of the relationship we have with our children and the quality of our own anxieties. And we have the privilege to be able to worry about these things. So mental health is becoming a thing, and everybody's got a therapist, and this kind of therapist, and that kind of a therapist, and a marriage therapist, and a
Well, the struggle is different now. Today it's about finding happiness. Then it was surviving.
exactly. So it's a different struggle, right? So now that we've got all sorts of therapists, there's different kinds of therapists. Some therapists are better than other therapists. Not all therapists are created equal, right? The way I see it is that our generation in general is seeking out to dive deeper. We're looking to dive deeper. We're not worried exclusively about our bodies anymore. We're now worried about our mental health as well. But we're groping in the darkness to try to find the solution to our sexual, I'm sorry, did I say sexual? To our, I don't know where that came from, Freudian, right? That was weird. But no, because
From a guy who has 11 kids.
no, but okay, let me go along that route of addictions, for example. How do you treat addiction today? Any kind of addiction. There's so many kinds of addiction. There's substance addictions, there's people addictions, there's love addictions, there's all sorts of addictions, right? How do you treat them? So what?
Isolation.
Oh, so that's one approach. You know where Kellogg's cornflakes comes from?
What?
You know who invented Kellogg's?
No.
This is true. This is a true story.
That's a joke.
This is a true story. Kellogg's cornflakes was invented by a Christian, a very religious fundamentalist, whatever that means, fundamentalist. I don't know what that means, but a very religious Christian who believed in the evils of sexual experiences. He felt that they were evil, so he created a sanatorium, I think is what they called it, like an isolation place where you wouldn't have to be tempted and those kind of things, and they were trying to make it was like a nutrition center where they were they were experimenting with different kinds of food that would mitigate the desire for sexual activity. And one day somebody burnt the cornflakes. They overcooked them in the in the oven, and instead of throwing them out, somebody tasted them and said, it's not so bad. It's not so terrible. This guy's name was Kellogg, but he never married. He had no kids because that was considered evil in his ideology, right? But he became an extremely wealthy man because he started selling Kellogg's cornflakes. They became a thing. They were like, what? Put a little milk and it tastes pretty good. We can sell this. So it was invented as an attempt to cure sexual activity, right? So very interesting, right? You can actually look it up. This is documented.
The first time decided he wanted to eat an egg.
Eat an egg?
Eat an egg.
The first guy?
This thing came out of a chicken.
Why don't we try eat it?
Let's eat it.
Oh God.
I mean,
Who came up with that idea, right? Right.
Oh, this is a good idea. Let's eat this.
Whose idea was to cook it? Not use it raw, cook it.
That can make for some good discussions.
It's interesting because you go to these 12-step programs. The first thing they ask you, that you have a problem with, to believe in a higher power that can that can relieve you of that, whatever that higher power is. So it is interesting that that's kind of what it is believing that there's
So we got the 12 steps, right? The
Yeah.
12 steps, they talk about the higher power
Yeah.
and surrendering, I think is one of those
Surrender,
steps.
yes,
I'm
exactly.
powerless, and now I've got to surrender to a higher power, and I got to pray, and I got to have a religious community, right? That's all part of the 12 steps, which is quite interesting because those 12 steps are actually very interesting in their spirituality. And they're non-denominational, I think, right?
Yes,
It's not like Christian or Jewish or anything. It's just a higher power, right? Which is pretty cool. So you see that where addiction therapy is going, and for, S-Bug says food addiction, alcohol addiction, right? Right. So she's saying, would there be less mental health issues? I'm not sure if it's a he or she, by the way, in Australia. Would there be less mental health issues if more people follow Torah and pray? I think so, because if you think just about the 12 steps, they are a spiritual expression. Implementation of our lives, right? So what's happening is that the world is moving towards a direction of being able to handle addictions just as one little corner of mental health, right? But is it really curing them or not? Right? I think it's working for a lot of people, but a lot of people struggle with it. So what I wanted to say here is that Sigmund Freud was the one, that the father of modern psychoanalysis. He was the one that introduced us to this idea that there's actually stuff going on inside of you. You got stuff inside of you. It's called the id. He discovered it. I think now the id is like your sexual needs or something. It's your ego. It's the ego. That's what it is. It's a sense of ego, and that's why self-esteem is so important. And everything is an expression of that wounded self-esteem, and maybe your family of origin, maybe somebody abused you as a child, maybe your parents didn't talk to you nicely, and that expresses itself in your romantic relationships right now. So whereas Sigmund Freud dug deep within us, and he discovered the id, he discovered the id. The Alter Rebbe dug even deeper. And he discovered that beyond the id, the sense of ego, which is the animal soul, lies the yid, which is even deeper to our core, to our truest essence, and that is our godly soul. And when you can recognize that you have both a yid and a yid, and id and yid in there, a Jew and an animal, right? You got a godly soul and you have an animal in there, and they've got to learn to coexist. Now you're like, okay, so if I figure that's what's going on inside of me, and then I can start to realize why certain things make me feel empty, why certain things make me feel fulfilled, right? And you're motivated to want to learn how to exercise them. You're motivated to want to learn how to, because if you're going to address your core issues at the core, then you're going to be happy at the surface. When we address not the symptoms, but what do you call it? Not the symptoms, but the cure? But the cure. That's what Tanya's doing. And that's how we're saying this is Kol HaTshuvos and Kol HaShalos. How did the Alter Rebbe know this? How did the Alter Rebbe know this information? Wouldn't you say that Tanya deals with the idea that we are never cured, but in a constant struggle? I don't think so. The Tanya is very practical about that. The Tanya says that some people are forever going to need to struggle. Right? Some people, I mean, most people, in your defense, Elaine. Yeah, most people are going to struggle. That's a little more advanced into where we're going in the Beinoni. But yeah, the Tanya does talk about the fact that we are going to have to struggle pretty much for the rest of our lives, and gives us meaning and purpose in the struggle. The Tanya teaches us to look forward to the journey and to find pleasure and purpose in the journey instead of worrying about the destinations. That's a very advanced idea, which we're going to be learning in Tanya. So how did Alter Rebbe know this information? Because he was a seer. He was a seer, S-E-E-R. He was a brilliant Torah scholar. He had razor-sharp intellect. He was extremely practical and very articulate. With that kind of a skill set, he was able to extract the deepest teachings of Torah and to actually teach them in a way that we can understand. There have been many great people in the history of the world, but not all of them were blessed with the gift of gab, the gift of articulation. Some of my greatest teachers were brilliant, but they didn't know how to express. They just couldn't. Other teachers are masters of eloquence, but they not very deep. Right? When you find someone with both qualities, now you're talking. That's extraordinary. Thank you. So that's what the Alter Rebbe is unique. And now, in addition to his brilliance, I believe that he was a seer as well. That he was able to see things that ordinary people couldn't. He was a very, very holy man. And when you learn the stories of the Alter Rebbe about how he was able, for example, as I mentioned recently, there was a woman who came to him. Her husband was disappeared, and now she was trying to move on with her life, but she didn't have a get. So he tells her, go to Vilna. This person, he'll help you. She goes to that person, and he makes fun of her. He's like, I don't know what your Rebbe is talking about. I don't know who your husband is. I never heard of you. Never heard of your husband. I don't know what's going on. 2-3 days later, he's called to the police station to identify a Jewish criminal by the name of Bam. How can he know such a thing? Clearly, there's some prophecy going on in here. So he was given access to stuff that we don't have. So when you have someone like that, that's able to give you that kind of direction, that's very helpful. Let me give you another metaphor. And this again from Chassidus. That, debtors' prisons. What are debtors' prisons? Thank God we have them anymore. But in the olden days, in the Pale of Settlement, you couldn't pay your debts. They threw you and your family into the dungeon. So they tell a story of a family that's down in the dungeon. Nobody's paying the bills because you can't. But they fed every day. Somebody throws in some bread and water every day. And then they live in the dungeon. And there's other families in there. And they're there for decades. The older generation dies, the younger generation marries. Right? They bury the old, the younger there, right? And so it goes on for 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. And the people up there, the poets, whoever the squire is, this is obviously a metaphor, but the children, the grandchildren, they keep up the tradition. They chuck bread down there and whatever their needs are, and that's how they live. So what happens to the 4th, 5th, 6th generation down in the dungeon? They've never seen the sunlight. They've never seen sunflowers. They've never seen a rainbow. To them, it's like a legend. Legend that there's a world where there's water and there's oceans and there's mountains and there's waterfalls and there's all sorts of things. We read about it in books. But the believers amongst us, they tell us that there's such things as color and sunrise and sunset. And 6, 7 generations down the road, it becomes like a fable. You got to be Meshuggah to believe in this, because this is the real world. The real world is darkness. It's bread coming out of a thing in the roof. Yeah, and that's it.
We have that today. It's called social welfare.
Right. So then one day comes, the hatch opens, and together with the bread and the water comes a person. A person comes down. I guess he couldn't pay his bill as well. So this guy gets thrown in there like, who are you? And he says, who are you? And he says, I'm coming from out there. There's a world out there with sunrise and sunset and rainbows and waterfalls. And he tells them what's going on. But how would they know? Because they've been here for so long. That's who we are. We're the generation that has been down in the dungeon for 2,000-3,000 years. 3,335 years since the Torah was given to Mount Sinai. We've been living in this lowly world. And we think this is it. This is the whole world. We learn about angels. We learn about God. We learn about Torah. We learn about mitzvahs. But really, all that matters is money. Wall Street. A real estate acquisitions is a profession. Mortgages. That's what matters. That's real life. Everything else is like an optional add-on extra. Then comes a guy that comes into the hatch and says, hey, I was just there. His name is a Rabbi. That's a Rebbe. He comes down and he says, guys, listen, don't get stuck in your don't get stuck in the mud, right? Raise up your heads, lift up your sights. You'll see there's a whole world out there. I was just there. I know what I'm talking about. That's what the Alter Rebbe is. He comes down and he opens our eyes to really what's going on all around us. So even though this book is written with a very broad horizon, it paints a picture which is pretty dramatic about the life of a person, like a warrior who has an internal battle within himself every single day of his life between good and bad, between the urges that force his soul to go downwards to the urge within him to pull his soul upwards. The chapters of this book, which are all interconnected, carry the learner to learn and recognize and appreciate and understand what the inner workings of his own soul. Understanding the precious balance, delicate balance within him. To appreciate the tools that you harbor within yourself, their strengths and their weaknesses, the way of war and the way of revolution. So what you're effectively doing in this book, is an introduction into your own soul. You're not learning about a different country. You're not learning about history. You're not learning about science. You're learning about you. This is the book of you. And that's what we're going to be doing here. All right?
Could it be that the mentors to the Alter Rebbe knew all this, but they could not articulate it?
Absolutely. And there's a reason why they couldn't articulate it, Steve. The reason I believe is because heaven didn't want them to. So they were denied those gifts because they weren't supposed to. Remember, Moses received this on Mount Sinai. But he couldn't spread it to the people because they weren't ready for it. There was a ban, right? There was an actual ban. You weren't allowed to teach it publicly. The novelty, there were certain people in history that changed the course of the secret Torah. The Arizal, for one, 500 years ago, he was the one who came out and declared from now on it's a mitzvah to publicize his wisdom. Okay, it's a mitzvah, but nobody could. It was still cryptic. You look at a book of Zohar, you can't read it. It's too hard. On Friday, we're going to watch a video on Friday morning about the Tanya. And the Tanya that was translated in English and Arabic and Italian and Spanish and so on. And the Rebbe was talking in there and he says, do you think that they didn't want to translate for the past 200, to translate the Tanya for the past 200 years? Of course they wanted to. They just couldn't. They didn't have the tools. And for us today, we today have the tools. We have the tools. So to answer your question, I want to say yes. Also, I want to say to Corey's point, could it be that Hashem allowed the Alter Rebbe to spread Chabad Hasidus at the beginning of the era of the Mashiach? I want to say absolutely yes. That's 100% on spot on. Because just like, 1,000 years for Hashem, for us is one day for God. It's a verse in Psalms, right? So if we're in the end of the 6th millennium now, 5,783, it means that for God it's Friday afternoon, right?
Is that why you think we're ready now?
So what happens Shabbos? What happens when comes Shabbos? That's Mashiach. Shabbos is a day of rest, a day of divine of spirituality. It's a day of Mashiach, right? So Mashiach comes at the end of the 6th millennium, at sunset, 3/4 of the way through the 6th millennium, right? As what do you do before Shabbos? What are we commanded to do before Shabbos? You're supposed to walk into the kitchen and have a little appetizer from the delicacies of Shabbos. Not the whole thing, just a little taste of the delicacies of Shabbos. So too, before the coming of Mashiach, we too have been gifted, as Corey points out, a foretaste of what will be with the coming of Mashiach. What's Mashiach? Mashiach is not a military experience. Mashiach is not a financial or economic prosperity alone. It's that, but it's much more. It's divine awareness, divine consciousness. So we are gifted with the awareness of that in advance, a little foretaste. And that is the teachings of Chassidus. All right, shkach, guys. We're going a little slowly, but it's okay. I think it's a good conversation. Thank you very much. Good Yantiv. Chag Sameach. May we all be experiencing a year of the study of Chassidus and the ways of Chassidus. Yes. We wear this on Shabbos and Yantiv.